Good morning. Spring is coming at last, and I hope you're all warming up, at least those of you in the Northern Hemisphere. So here we are at Miss Wetherby's Challenges in 1942, the fourth one in the series. Here we still find Clementine and Aadhirai as they continue navigating the personal and societal pressures of war. The story continues with a medical crisis for Clementine, who struggles to recover from a life-threatening infection following surgery. Amidst the tension of the blackout and strict government rationing, the women and their friends face domestic challenges, including criminal muggings, the conscription of household staff into munition factories, and the arrival of a young German refugee named Cass. The text intricately portrays the emotional toll of the war, highlighting the resilience required to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the loss of loved ones and the constant threat of violence. As Clementine recovers, the focus shifts to the evolving dynamics within Belmont House, exploring themes of justice, grief, and romance. Through the eyes of Aadhirai and her companions, the story captures the unique atmosphere of Wanstead in Essex, where the grim realities of the legal system and military service intersect with the quiet perseverance of daily life. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the AI voices. And of course, if you would like to subscribe and like and ring that bell to support this channel, that would be fantastic. Enjoy.
Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, like it's a math problem or something.
Exactly, like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, well, there it is.
It's very binary, and honestly, it's comforting. We really like things to be visible and, easily categorized.
We do. But then you step into the world of, say, neurodevelopment or chronic trauma, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just totally useless.
Yeah, you're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
And that murkiness, that really profound, terrifying uncertainty is exactly where we are dropping you today.
Oh, it is deep, deep uncertainty.
So for you listening, I want you to imagine stepping out of your front door tonight, but there are absolutely no streetlights.
None.
No light from the neighbor's windows. No car headlights. Just this oppressive physical darkness that lasts literally for years.
It's so hard to even conceptualize that now.
It really is. We are pulling you straight into the freezing, exhausting, and just incredibly dangerous world of 1942 London.
Such a specific and brutal year.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to examine the fourth novel in this incredible 5-part saga that details the life of Miss Clementine Wetherby.
Which is such a fascinating perspective to take.
It is, because she's this wealthy woman raised in the absolute colonial luxury of India, and she has returned to London basically just in time for the whole world to catch fire.
Yeah, and 1942 is it's a very specific kind of fire.
How do you mean?
Well, you have to realize that the acute, fiery terror of the 1940 Blitz, the bombs raining down every single night, the sudden explosive destruction, that phase has largely passed.
Because the Luftwaffe is mostly off fighting in Russia by this point, right?
Exactly. So what has replaced those nightly bombings is something that is arguably much harder to endure on a purely psychological level.
It's just a grind.
A chronic, freezing, and exhausting grind. Society is settling into this long, brutal war, and that initial shot of adrenaline from 1940 has completely worn off.
I think we often carry this, this inherited mythology of the home front.
Oh, absolutely. The whole keep calm and carry on thing.
Right. We picture this unified utopia where neighbors are cheerfully sharing their rations and everyone's pulling together in a brightly lit kitchen to defeat Hitler.
Which is a nice story, but it's not the whole truth.
Not at all. In this source material, looking specifically through the microcosm of a London suburb called Wanstead, we see that the gravest dangers aren't actually falling from the sky anymore.
No, they're right there on the pavement with you.
The home front in 1942 reads essentially as a battlefield of its own. It's a place where the breakdown of civic order is just as deadly as any bomb.
It perfectly illustrates this concept of collateral mortality.
Collateral mortality. I like that phrase.
Yeah, it's this idea that the infrastructure of a society can only handle so much baseline stress before the basic safety nets just dissolve.
So let's look at the physical toll right out of the gate, because the book doesn't pull any punches.
It really doesn't.
It opens on New Year's Eve, heading right into 1942, and the atmosphere is suffocatingly bleak. We're at Wanstead Hospital, and Clementine Wetherby is dying.
And not from anything heroic or war-related.
Right. She hasn't been pulled from a bombed-out building. She is dying from sepsis following a completely routine appendectomy.
Which is just a terrifying reality of the era. I mean, we take antibiotics entirely for granted today.
Oh, for sure. You get a cut, you get a pill, you're fine.
But in 1942, before there was any widespread availability of penicillin for the civilian population, an infection from a standard surgery was basically a coin toss with death.
The body's immune response to the infection just goes into overdrive, right?
Yeah, it attacks itself and starts shutting down organs. It's brutal.
And the text gives us this harrowing perspective through Clementine's closest friend, Aadhirai, also known as Ms. Varma in the neighborhood.
She's such a grounding character in this saga.
She really is. And she spends these endless, agonizing nights in this horribly bleak, smoke-stained hospital waiting room.
Which, if we think about the physical environment there, it's just grim.
It's awful. Aadhirai is wrapped in this thick woolen coat that she had to borrow from a neighbor, and she is shivering constantly.
Because of the fuel rationing.
Exactly. Hospitals aren't these warm, sterile, brightly lit environments that we know today. They're freezing.
The book mentions she memorizes every scuff on the dark red linoleum floor, right?
Yeah, and there's this faint, nauseating whiff of stale tobacco left behind by some man who was incessantly smoking while waiting for his wife to give birth.
It's such a great detail. The physical environment is completely mirroring the psychological state of the whole country.
Bland, devoid of comfort, and utterly exhausting.
Right, and outside the two large windows of that waiting room, it is pitch black.
Not even a joyful play of moonlight, as the text notes.
Which brings us to, honestly, one of the most insidious physical dangers of this era.
The blackout itself.
Yeah. So Aadhirai is eventually told by a nurse, Nurse Ridley, to go home and get some sleep.
And she steps out onto Herman Hill, and it's as black as coal. And for you listening, we really need to conceptualize the blackout here. This wasn't just like dimming the lights to set a mood.
Oh, no. It was absolute crushing darkness enforced by the rule of law.
You had the air raid precautions wardens, right? The ARP.
The ARP wardens, exactly. They would literally patrol the streets, screaming at people for even a sliver of light showing through a curtain.
It was intense. Car headlights had to be fitted with these slotted covers, so they only emitted this tiny, useless downward slit of light.
And the street lamps were just turned off completely.
So Aadhirai is walking home in this literal sensory deprivation tank.
She's physically exhausted. She's terrified. Her best friend is going to die.
And out of nowhere, she feels this violent tug on her arm. Her handbag is just wrenched from her.
And the force of it spins her around and sends her sprawling violently onto the freezing hard road.
It happens so fast she doesn't even have time to cry out.
It's just an incredibly jarring moment of violence.
And what does the attacker actually get? A bag containing a mere 2 pounds.
Barely anything.
Barely anything. But the physical toll on Aadhirai is immense. She has this deeply painful shoulder. She is covered in freezing, wet mud. And the psychological shock is profound.
But the most telling detail in that whole sequence is what happens when she gets back to the house.
She refuses to call the police.
She absolutely refuses, because she knows it's pointless.
The blackout is basically the perfect accomplice.
It really is. It strips away the entire social contract. I mean, if no one can see you, the societal pressure to behave morally just evaporates for a certain segment of the population.
Reading it, it feels more like Gotham City than a historical drama. It's this complete moral breakdown in the dark.
And unfortunately, that violence only escalates as the year goes on.
Oh, yeah. We have to talk about what happens to Donald Cross.
That scene is rough.
It's brutal. So Donald Cross is the local shop owner, and by all accounts, he is a deeply disliked, wretched man.
Very unpleasant character.
Very. But the retribution he suffers is just barbaric. 2 young women from the neighborhood, Nora and Celia, are walking home in the dim light, and they hear this low, wet, grunting noise coming from near Mr. Cross's back double doors.
This is so creepy.
Right. They investigate, and they find Mr. Cross. And his face is just an unrecognizable mass of dark, congealed blood.
He's just groaning and twitching on the ground.
We later get the actual medical report via this gossiping nurse named Jenny Harris, and the injuries are staggering.
It wasn't just a mugging.
No. His jaw's completely shattered, he's missing 6 teeth, his eye socket is cracked, his skull is fractured, and he's been stabbed in the upper chest.
And the attacker actually pulled the knife out, which obviously made the bleeding much, much worse.
He is literally left for dead.
The sheer savagery of that attack points to a profound breakdown in the rule of law. It wasn't about stealing rations, it was entirely disproportionate violence.
The police immediately suspect a man named William Blackwater, right?
Yes. Blackwater and his associate, a woman named Margaret Perry, had previously been jailed, and Mr. Cross was the primary witness against them.
So it bears all the hallmarks of a revenge killing. Or at least an attempted one. But wait, this is where I really struggle. I find it hard to believe a modern justice system just collapses to the point where known violent criminals are roaming the streets taking revenge.
You think so, yeah.
I mean, how does a violent criminal just walk free in the middle of a war? Weren't there strict emergency powers?
That is exactly the question that Jeremy, who is Clementine's fiancé and a really brilliant legal mind, tries to figure out.
He starts digging into the court records.
He does, and he unearths this terrifying reality. There is no sound legal reason for their early release. Blackwater and Perry had their 18-month sentences massively reduced, and they were released with 0 restrictions.
But why?
Because the literal mechanics of the justice system were fracturing under the weight of the war.
Like, practically speaking.
Practically speaking, the prisons were severely understaffed because the guards had all been conscripted into the military.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the guards being drafted.
Exactly. And the physical prisons themselves had been heavily damaged by the bombing in 1940 and 1941, which led to massive overcrowding in the facilities that were still standing.
So they just didn't have anywhere to put people.
Right. Judges and parole boards were completely overwhelmed. They were essentially clearing out lower-level offenders to make room for the new wartime criminals, black marketeers, looters, and enemy aliens.
The system was hemorrhaging capacity.
So highly dangerous people just slipped right through the cracks.
So the government is essentially saying to the public, we can't manage this. You are on your own.
Precisely. And that failure of basic civic infrastructure extends way beyond just the police and the courts. It bleeds into the most fundamental necessity of life, which is the food supply.
Right. Later in the year, the local butcher, Mr. Peabody, is literally sent to prison for 2 years.
And he didn't stab anyone.
No. He sold contaminated pork that ended up killing the local vicar, Reverend Hewlett, through blood poisoning. And several other people in the neighborhood collapsed and were violently ill.
It's such a tragedy.
But how does a licensed neighborhood butcher end up selling lethal meat? Weren't there health inspectors?
To understand that, you really need to understand the 1942 British food supply chain.
Okay, lay it on me.
The Ministry of Food controlled everything through very strict rationing, and meat was heavily rationed by price, not by weight.
Okay.
So a butcher like Mr. Peabody had a very set allocation of meat he could legally sell each week. But the public demand for extra meat was completely insatiable. People were chronically hungry, and they were sick and tired of eating endless potatoes and powdered eggs.
So that creates an incredibly lucrative black market.
Exactly. The black market was run by these operators known as spivs, basically men who managed to avoid the draft and dealt entirely in illicit goods.
So Peabody gets involved with them.
Yeah, facing economic pressure, and honestly, perhaps just simple greed, Mr. Peabody likely bypassed the heavily regulated Ministry of Food supply chains to buy unregulated pork off the black market.
To make an extra shilling.
Right. And because the health inspectors were, again, either drafted into the military or completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of this illicit trade, this diseased meat made it straight onto the chopping block in Wanstead.
That is just terrifying. You survive the Blitz, you survive the blackout muggers, and then your local vicar dies because the neighborhood butcher bought a shady pig in an alleyway.
It's all connected. When Clementine finally recovers from her bout with sepsis, she has this moment of stark realization. She tells Aadhirai not to walk home in the dark anymore.
And she says, as a direct quote from the book, "We live in minacious times."
Menacious, meaning menacing, threatening.
It's such a great word.
It perfectly captures the atmosphere of the novel. The blackout is no longer just this passive defense mechanism against German bombers. It has become an active physical manifestation of the era's danger.
It acts as a cloak for everything. Petty theft, brutal revenge, the quiet, lethal transaction of poisoned meat.
It covers all of it.
So if the physical and civic infrastructure is failing that spectacularly, the social infrastructure has to radically adapt. The old rules simply can't apply anymore.
They get thrown out the window.
And that pulls us into the second major theme we need to unpack today, the profound leveling of the social classes.
Because war really is the ultimate equalizer. It forces a radical reorganization of human capital.
We established early on that Clementine Wetherby is wealthy. She grew up in colonial Bombay, she has money, she has status. But in 1942, wealth cannot buy immunity from government directives.
It can't, because the government fundamentally changed the law. In December 1941, they passed the National Service Act.
The Number 2 Act.
Yes, the Number 2 Act. And this is a crucial piece of legislation because it introduced the conscription of women.
Unprecedented.
Completely. Initially, it applied to unmarried women and childless widows between the ages of 20 and 30.
Which perfectly targets Clementine's domestic staff. She employs these two young women, Nora and Celia, and sure enough, they receive their government directive to report for work at a munitions factory in Epping.
And Clementine, despite her wealth and her aristocratic background, she doesn't try to pull strings or stop them.
No. She knows the reality of the war. She actually handles it with a lot of grace. She gives them a very generous 20-pound bonus each when they leave.
Which was a massive amount of money for a working-class girl in 1942.
Huge. But their departure leaves Clementine and Aadhirai with this stark, almost comical realization.
Yeah.
They don't actually know how to run a house.
It is a profound culture shock for them.
I mean, think about Clementine's background. During her 40 years living in India as part of the colonial elite, she wasn't even allowed to brush her own hair until she was 25.
It's mind-boggling.
Her mother firmly believed that was a job for a servant. It took 2 servants just to tie her corset every morning. She had never drawn her own bath.
She had been entirely shielded from the physical, mundane realities of keeping a human being alive and clean.
Exactly. She was the product of an extreme, highly stratified social operating system.
And suddenly that operating system has been uninstalled overnight.
So she is in 1942 London. She picks up a mop and tries to clean her own floors. And after just 1 hour, she admits she is completely whacked out.
She physically cannot handle the labor.
She actually has to apologize to Aadhirai for her previous ignorance about how exhausting domestic labor truly is.
But it's not just the wealthy elite who are forced into uncomfortable new realities here.
Right, it goes both ways.
The conscription of women meant that working-class women were also thrust into roles of unprecedented authority. Look at the character of Mrs. Clark.
Oh, Mrs. Clark is phenomenal.
She's the best. Before the war, she worked in a typewriter factory, a very repetitive, subordinate, quiet role.
But because all the young men have been called up to fight, she transitions into becoming a full-time bus conductor.
Which, prior to the war, was an exclusively male domain. It required managing money, maintaining tight schedules, and above all, commanding the public space of the bus.
And Mrs. Clark commands it like an absolute champion.
She really does?
She has these incredible stories she brings back to the neighborhood from her routes. You see her enforcing the rules on people who, pre-war, would never have taken orders from a working-class woman.
Like the man with the dog.
Yes. There is this wealthy man who boards her bus and demands a seat for his dog because he claims the floor is too grimy for the animal to sit on.
And Mrs. Clark just flat out refuses him.
She tells him where to go. And then there's a nun who insists she doesn't have to pay the tuppence fare because of her religious order.
And Mrs. Clark stubbornly stands her ground, holding up the entire journey until the nun finally pays.
Is this micro-level social revolution? The war necessitates female empowerment out of sheer desperation for labor, and women like Mrs. Clark realize they're perfectly capable of wielding that authority.
But of course, that authority also puts her on the front lines of the civic decay we discussed earlier.
Right, we have to talk about the incident with the canvas bag. This part is terrifying.
It's incredibly tense.
So Mrs. Clark is working a late shift, and this sullen, shabbily dressed man boards the bus. As he's rummaging around to find his fare, his canvas bag opens just slightly, and Mrs. Clark sees the trigger mechanism of a gun.
Now keep in mind it's 1942. People are entirely used to seeing soldiers in uniform carrying Lee-Enfield rifles on public transport. That's perfectly normal.
But her intuition, which is now honed by managing thousands of passengers, tells her this man is not a soldier, and that weapon is not standard issue.
She notices the bag is way too short to hold a standard rifle.
So what does she do? She doesn't panic. She quietly waits until she spots a policeman out on the dark street, hails him, and stops the bus.
And when the police search the man's bag, They find several handguns, a submachine gun, and enough ammunition to cause a massacre.
Which raises the obvious question. Why does a shabby man on a London bus have a submachine gun?
Where does that even come from, right?
Exactly.
It speaks to the chaotic influx of weaponry into civilian spaces during the war. The whole country was flooded with arms. You had the Home Guard, which was often poorly regulated and haphazard.
Dad's army kind of stuff.
Right, but with real guns. You had deserters from the military who stole their weapons and went on the run. You had a thriving black market for firearms driven by the criminal underworld who were exploiting the blackout.
So Mrs. Clark, a former typewriter factory worker,
Yeah.
single-handedly prevents what could have been a catastrophic armed robbery or worse, simply because the war forced her into a position of vigilance and authority.
It's a brilliant character moment, but that forced leveling of society, putting everyone into the same chaotic melting pot, creates incredible friction.
Especially for someone like Clementine, who is constantly bumping up against her own ingrained aristocratic prejudices.
She's a really hard time adjusting.
She has this moment where she snaps at Aadhirai over a perceived insult, and Aadhirai doesn't back down. She calls Clementine out, telling her she lives with her head in the sand because of her privileged upbringing.
Clementine also really struggles to understand the motivations of the working-class characters around her.
Like Bert and Miriam.
Exactly. She views characters like Bert and his niece Miriam as just greedy or uncouth. She fails to recognize that their behavior is driven by the sheer economic terror of the era.
Right. If you've never been hungry a day in your life, the desperation of someone hoarding rations looks like greed rather than basic survival.
The absolute peak of this class friction, though, is her conflict with her gardener, Mr. Titchmarsh.
We really need to unpack this scene because it is pivotal to Book 4.
It's the emotional core of her arc.
So, Mr. Titchmarsh has a son, Frankie. He's young, eager, and absolutely desperate to sign up for the military and go fight the Germans.
As many young men were.
But Mr. Titchmarsh reacts to this eagerness with horrific harshness. He punishes Frankie constantly. He makes him do extra back-breaking digging in the garden, and he even gives the boy 2 black eyes.
Now, to Clementine, looking through the lens of a wealthy employer observing a hired laborer, Titchmarsh is simply a violent, cruel bully.
She is appalled. She marches out to the shed, confronts Mr. Titchmarsh, essentially tells him he is a monster, and fires him on the spot.
She asserts her ultimate authority as the wealthy landowner. She solves the problem with her economic power.
But she entirely lacks the psychological context of what she is actually witnessing.
She doesn't understand the generational trauma at play at all.
Break that down for us. What is she missing?
Mr. Titchmarsh is a veteran of the First World War. He survived the trenches. He knows exactly what mechanized slaughter looks like up close.
The mud, the gas, all of it.
All of it. And now, 20 years later, he is watching his young, naive son eagerly, joyfully marching off to face the exact same meat grinder.
Oh, wow.
So Titchmarsh's harshness isn't simple malice. It is a desperate, deeply traumatized, and obviously ultimately misguided attempt to harden his son for the horrors to come.
Or perhaps, subconsciously, he is punishing the boy for his eagerness to throw his life away.
Exactly. It's a father's absolute terror masquerading as violence.
And Aadhirai is the one who points this out to Clementine. She tells Clementine she needs to look past her own upper-class outrage and actually see the man's pain. She tells Clementine to apologize.
Which, in the context of Clementine's character arc over these 4 books, is a monumental ask.
An aristocratic woman from colonial India does not apologize to the gardener.
Never.
But she does it. She actually walks over to Mr. Titchmarsh's house. She stands in his claustrophobic, shabby little hallway, and she apologizes.
It's a huge moment for her.
She admits that in India, her family treated servants as an entirely separate species of human, and she realizes she was entirely wrong to interfere in his relationship with his son without understanding the context.
It is the moment she actively sheds her colonial operating system. She finally accepts the interdependent, messy, equalizing reality of wartime Britain.
She recognizes that she needs Titchmarsh, not just for his labor in the garden, but because they are part of the same shattered community.
And she goes a step further to help him. She uses her niece, Ada's supposed psychic abilities to give Mr. Titchmarsh a lifeline.
Right. She tells him that Ada had a vision of Frankie returning after the war. She says he was injured, his arm was in a sling, but he was alive.
And Titchmarsh, who the text establishes is not a religious man at all, just breaks down and cries.
He accepts this bizarre psychic comfort because he is so psychologically starved for hope.
Which brings us to the third crucial layer of this deep dive. We've examined the physical dangers of the blackout and the social upheaval of conscription. But the most damaging toll of 1942 is invisible.
It is the shadow war.
The profound psychological trauma operating just beneath the surface, especially for those who possess knowledge they cannot share.
Yes, the burdens of foresight and intelligence. And this is where I want to push back on the author's narrative choices for just a moment.
Okay, let's hear it.
We are dealing with a deeply researched historical fiction saga. The rationing, the blackouts, the geopolitics, it's all grounded in intense reality. And yet right in the middle of it, we have Ada, Clementine's niece, who literally has psychic visions.
She does.
She predicts the exact year the war will end, 1945. She has visions of Winston Churchill before she even knows who the prime minister is. Is Ada actually supposed to be magic? Because that feels like it breaks the grounded rules of the universe.
It's a fair critique, for sure, but I would argue Ada isn't magic in a fantasy genre sense. She is a brilliant literary device.
How so?
In a world where the future is terrifyingly, paralyzingly uncertain, Ada is the literal manifestation of the collective anxiety, the trauma, and the desperate societal need for certainty. She embodies the psychological burden of foresight.
Okay, I can see that. Especially because of how the government reacts to her. They don't treat her like a carnival sideshow or lock her up.
No, her abilities catch the attention of Emma Foster.
Emma Foster is a high-ranking intelligence officer operating out of a covert office in Gray's Inn. And Emma treats Ada as a vital strategic asset.
Because the government in 1942 was desperately trying to figure out how to keep society from collapsing once the shooting eventually stopped.
Right. Emma Foster tasks Ada with drawing visions not of battles or troop movements, but of post-war rebuilding.
It's all about the aftermath.
Emma sits this young girl down and lays out a terrifying reality. She tells Ada that even when the Nazis are defeated, England will be on the brink of total bankruptcy. Millions of citizens will be homeless because of the bombing. Disease will be rampant. The infrastructure will be in absolute ruins.
So Emma tasks Ada with drawing the victory posters and the architectural rebuilding plans before the war is even half over.
It's wild to think about that level of forward planning while you're currently being bombed.
But it grounds Ada's visions in the very real bureaucratic anxiety of the era. Historically, this aligns perfectly with the commissioning of the Beveridge Report in 1942.
The Beveridge Report. That laid the foundation for the modern welfare state, right?
Exactly. The intelligence services and the government knew that winning the war wouldn't matter at all if the country starved to death the day after peace was declared.
But Emma Foster isn't just dealing in post-war planning. She is also the conduit for the darkest, most immediate psychological horrors of the conflict. Because Emma is running intelligence networks deep into occupied Europe.
And this brings us to the absolutely devastating storyline of Cass.
Cass is a 15-year-old German refugee who has been taken in by Clementine's household. And her backstory is chilling.
It's incredibly dark.
Before she escaped to England, Cass had been working as a servant in Germany for a prominent judge who was an ardent member of the Nazi Party. She describes this man as having the devil in him, ruling his household and his courtroom with absolute terrifying fear.
And Cass was eventually targeted by the Gestapo for possessing a political pamphlet.
She managed to escape, but she had to leave her parents behind in Germany.
So she is sitting in London, physically safe, but psychologically tortured by the unknown fate of her family.
And through Emma Foster's clandestine intelligence network, a message finally filters through.
It is meant to be a moment of absolute joy.
Emma brings Kaz to her office in Gray's Inn, and initially there's this jubilant atmosphere. Her parents are alive.
But then Emma reads the full contents of the smuggled letter.
And the reality of the news is utterly devastating.
Because of what the intelligence reveals about their living conditions.
The parents are alive, yes, but they are being forced to identify their house as Jewish. They're being forced to wear the yellow stars on their clothing.
It's the beginning of the end for them.
And Emma Foster, this hardened intelligence officer, has to sit across from a 15-year-old girl and explain the context. Emma admits that while they have known about the segregation in the ghettos, the broader picture of what the Nazis are systematically doing to the Jewish population is just beginning to filter into London.
Historically, late 1942 is precisely when the Allies received the Regner telegram, along with other undeniable intelligence confirming the existence of extermination camps and the final solution. The rumors of mass murder were solidifying into horrific fact.
And the sheer helplessness of Cass's situation is staggering. The intelligence network only flows one way. She cannot write back. She cannot send money. She cannot orchestrate a
Just
rhythm.
completely paralyzed.
She just has to sit in the house in Wanstead, eat her rations, and know that her parents are walking around Germany wearing a mark of death. How does a teenager process that?
It is a profound, paralyzing psychological burden. It's like, you are safe, but your loved ones are trapped in a burning building, and you just have to watch through a soundproof window.
That's a haunting way to put it.
Yeah.
And Cass's situation isn't the only moral gray area the characters are forced to navigate regarding Germans. We have the ongoing tragedy of Mr. Weiss.
Mr. Weiss, he perfectly illustrates the cruel bureaucracy of war.
For context, Mr. Weiss was the German ship steward who was incredibly kind to Clementine and Aadhirai when they sailed back from India in the earlier books. He was a good, decent man.
But simply because of the geography of his birth, he is classified as an enemy alien.
He is swept up in the government's panic policy of internment and locked in a camp on the Isle of Man.
That stems from Winston Churchill's infamous directive, Pollard the Lot. The fear of fifth columnists and spies was so intense that thousands of innocent German and Austrian refugees, many of whom were Jewish and fleeing the Nazis themselves, were imprisoned alongside actual fascist sympathizers.
Clementine, out of a deep sense of loyalty, undertakes this brutal journey across the Irish Sea to visit him. And I want to highlight the physical reality of this journey because it shows how much she cares.
It's an awful trip.
She takes this tiny boat called the Swallow. The sea is churning violently. The skipper is an elderly man with a long gray beard who is actively drinking from his silver flask while steering the vessel. Clementine is violently seasick the entire time, but she pushes through.
And the reward for her endurance is just pure heartbreak.
When she finally reaches the internment camp, it's surreal. It's this bleak, fading 1920s bed and breakfast, but it is surrounded by heavy barbed wire and armed soldiers.
And Mr. Weiss is a shell of his former self.
He looks like a scolded, lost child. The confident, capable steward she knew on the ship has been entirely stripped away by years of unjustified imprisonment.
And his psychological torture is compounded by his personal life. He has a sweetheart, a British woman named Annabelle, who actually lives on the Isle of Man.
But Annabelle's father is dying of cancer, and he harbors an absolute virulent hatred for all Germans.
He refuses to distinguish between the Nazis bombing London and this gentleman who used to serve tea on a cruise ship.
He outright forbids Annabelle from seeing him.
And the bureaucracy only makes it worse. Later in the year, the government abruptly moves Mr. Weiss from the Isle of Man to a camp in Tilbury, just outside London.
Jeremy visits him there, and he describes Tilbury as the Wild West of England. The conditions are appalling.
Just filth everywhere.
Mr. Weiss is living in absolute squalor in a battered, damp, terraced house. The cruel irony is that he is technically granted more freedom. He is allowed to walk around the local area.
But he can't get a proper job because of his status.
Right. And he cannot travel back to the Isle of Man to be with Annabelle because he would be immediately recognized and arrested for violating his travel restrictions.
So he and Annabelle are trapped in this agonizing, indefinite limbo. They are waiting for either the global conflict to end or for her father to succumb to cancer.
Mr. Weiss is entirely a victim of circumstance. His life paused and ruined simply for holding the wrong passport at the wrong time in history.
That feeling of being trapped, of being ground down by the endlessness of the war and the absolute inability to control your own destiny, it leads to what I think is the most silent, devastating tragedy in the entire book.
You're talking about Miss Gordon.
Euphemia Gordon.
She is Jeremy's secretary at his law office in New Fetter Lane. She is incredibly loyal, fiercely efficient. She is the administrative backbone of his life.
She lives in a small room directly above the law office.
She represents the millions of unmarried women whose lives were entirely subsumed by their work and the war effort.
One morning, Jeremy arrives at the office, and the door is locked. Miss Gordon hasn't come down to open up.
He finally gets inside, goes upstairs to her room, and he finds her dead.
She has quietly, methodically committed suicide, sitting in her armchair.
There is no dramatic note. There is no explosive, inciting event. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a spy.
It was just exhaustion. It was a woman who woke up one morning and realized she could no longer endure the isolation, the fear, the rationing, the blackout, and the grinding despair of 1942.
She just opted out.
And the tragedy is compounded by the reaction of her family. Jeremy manages to track down her only living relative, a sister living in Saginaw, Canada. He sends a telegram informing her of Euphemia's death.
And the sister sends a telegram back, flatly refusing to cross the Atlantic or even participate in the arrangements because in her rigid religious view, suicide is an unforgivable sin.
She abandons her sister in death just as she was abandoned in life.
Miss Gordon is the ultimate manifestation of the unseen epidemic of wartime despair. We tally the casualties of war in terms of soldiers killed in action or civilians crushed by rubble.
But Miss Gordon represents the thousands of people whose spirits were simply crushed by the sheer atmospheric weight of the conflict.
The lack of a mental health vocabulary in the 1940s meant she suffered entirely alone. And Jeremy is left with the agonizing task of packing up this woman's entire existence into a single scuffed suitcase.
It really makes you step back and genuinely wonder, how does anyone survive this? How do you wake up every single day knowing the news on the radio is going to be terrible, your food is going to be tasteless and scarce, the streets are going to be pitch black and dangerous, and your friends might just quietly give up?
You survive through defiance. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial mechanism of the home front.
Yes. Defiance through normalcy. Acts of profound, almost absurd resilience.
Because after exploring the darkness of the Shadow War, the violence of the streets, and the trauma of the continent, the characters in Wanstead don't just lie down and surrender to the gloom.
They aggressively pursue love, milestones, and even mundane daily chores as acts of absolute rebellion against the chaos.
It is a psychological necessity. Forward momentum is the only antidote to despair.
Pursuing these milestones in 1942, getting married, having a baby, it isn't naive. It isn't ignoring the war. It's a psychological ballast.
I love that. It's like putting a heavy iron keel on a sailboat in the middle of a hurricane. They are forcing normalcy into their lives to keep their minds from capsizing.
That is a much better way to look at it. These domestic milestones are acts of defiance against the very goal of fascism, which is to destroy the individual's right to a private, joyful life.
Let's start with Clementine and Jeremy. After 4 books of build-up, they finally get married.
But look at the context surrounding it. Jeremy is a prosecutor, and he is literally in the middle of prosecuting one of the most terrifying figures of the era, Gordon Cummins.
Blackout Ripper.
Right. For those who don't know, Gordon Cummins was a real-life serial killer operating in London in 1942. He was an RAF cadet who used the pitch-black conditions of the blackout to hunt and brutally murder women.
He turned the government's primary defense mechanism against the Luftwaffe into his own personal hunting ground. The psychological terror he inflicted on London was immense.
And Jeremy is spending his days submerged in the gruesome details of these murders, fighting to put this monster on the gallows.
But despite that horror, he takes a few days off, marries Clementine, and they take a train to Leigh-on-Sea for their honeymoon. Now, if you are listening and picturing a romantic seaside getaway, erase that immediately.
It is not glamorous. It is the antithesis of glamour.
They check into the Grand Hotel, which is anything but. The breakfast is a disgusting, greasy mess. They walk down to the beach, and the sand is covered in thick coils of rusting barbed wire and massive concrete defensive gun emplacements pointing out of the channel.
The entire town has been requisitioned and is swarming with loud, bored army recruits.
And the social interactions offer no escape. No. They are sitting in a drab hotel lobby, and they run into a man named Brigadier Harris. They're trying to enjoy their honeymoon, and the Brigadier casually traps them in a conversation where he tells a horrifying, detailed story about his first wife agonizingly dying of malaria in India back in 1921.
It's cold, it's raining, the locals are miserable.
But Jeremy and Clementine are ecstatically happy.
They really are.
They walk along that barbed wire beach in the pouring rain, huddled under a single umbrella, completely and utterly in love. They are deliberately carving out a tiny, fiercely protected slice of joy in a ruined world. It is an act of supreme defiance.
We see that exact same defiance in Celia and Peter.
This is such a beautiful arc. Peter was an RAF Spitfire pilot. He was badly injured in combat and has been confined to a wheelchair for a long time.
The physical injury led to a severe psychological depression. He felt entirely discarded, like Fighter Command had just tossed him on the scrap heap because he was no longer useful.
The loss of identity for young men whose entire worth was tied up in their physical ability to fight was a massive crisis during the war.
But then a miracle happens. Peter regains the ability to walk. He drops the wheelchair, he starts using a cane, and eventually he drops the cane altogether.
And the catalyst for this miraculous recovery isn't a new medical treatment. It is a renewed will to live, because Celia is pregnant.
Yes. Now, in the context of 1942, an unmarried pregnant woman working in a munitions factory was a scandal. Celia actually gets fired from her job because of it.
But they do not care. They rush to get married at the Ilford Registry Office. And the details of this wedding are a masterclass in resilience. Peter wears his freshly pressed RAF uniform. Celia's mother, Lillian, takes apart her own vintage wedding dress, meticulously dyes the fabric, and remakes it to fit Celia.
Because of clothing rationing, the whole Make Do and Mend campaign, you couldn't just go buy a wedding dress. You had to cannibalize the past to celebrate the future.
It's a scrappy, beautiful, resilient moment. And the psychological shift in Peter is profound. He stops obsessing over returning to a combat squadron. He stops chasing a glorious death in the sky. He starts talking practically about becoming a flight instructor because he actively wants to survive the war to raise his child.
New life defeats the death drive.
But the defiance isn't only about new life. We see defiance in how these characters approach death itself. Consider the formidable Mrs. Ponsford.
Oh, Mrs. Ponsford. Oh. She is a pillar of the Wanstead community. Very traditional, very respected.
She suffers a stroke while playing a game of rummy. She recovers slightly, but her health is failing, and she eventually dies of pneumonia. But before she dies, she leaves a final, shocking directive that absolutely scandalizes the neighborhood.
She leaves her body to medical science.
Which in the 1940s was highly unusual and deeply controversial for a woman of her social standing.
It causes a massive uproar. Her husband, who is a conservative politician, is absolutely furious. He is deeply embarrassed that he cannot give his prominent wife a traditional, heavily attended burial in the churchyard. It hurts his political image.
Her daughter, Anne, who serves in the WRNS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, is thoroughly disgusted. Mrs. Ponsford was a devout Christian, and Anne feels that donating her body violates her faith in the sanctity of death.
But Mrs. Ponsford, in her final act, rejects the vanity of a traditional funeral. She makes an incredibly progressive scientific choice.
She knows that doctors need cadavers to learn how to fix the broken young men coming back from the front lines. Even in her mortal remains, she is choosing to push society forward. It is a defiant rejection of useless tradition.
And I love her for that. And that defiance, that refusal to let the war dictate every single aspect of life, is also present in the absolute absurdity of their daily chores.
The mundane constantly, comically interrupts the grand historical narrative.
The moth invasion is a perfect example of this duality.
It's my favorite scene in the book. Clementine discovers that her house has been overrun by a massive infestation of clothes moths, Tiniola basileella. They are destroying the carpets, the wool coats, everything.
Now, in the middle of a global conflict where cities are burning, Clementine declares war on insects. She hires a local exterminator, Mr. Aadhirai.
And Mr. Aadhirai treats this job with the gravity of a military operation.
He arrives at the house looking like a soldier preparing to go over the top into the trenches.
He straps on a sophisticated heavy-duty gas mask. He meticulously seals all the edges of the blackout curtains with tape. And then he sets off a literal chemical bomb inside the living room.
Clementine, Aadhirai, and the entire household have to evacuate and sit in their neighbor's house for hours while toxic gas fills their home to eradicate the moths.
It perfectly encapsulates the surreal, schizophrenic reality of 1942. On one side of London, Jeremy is dealing with the psychological horror of a serial killer exploiting the blackout. On the other side, Clementine is deploying chemical warfare against fabric pests.
It keeps them grounded. You can't spend 24 hours a day terrified of the Gestapo. Eventually, you have to worry about your carpets.
It's the same energy as Aadhirai's disastrous foray into the dating world.
Aadhirai decides she cannot let the war pause her personal life forever.
Right, she needs to get out. She accepts a date with a man who lives in West 12, which is a massive journey across London in the dark.
And hours later, she returns to Wanstead in the pouring rain, riding in a wildly expensive taxi that costs 30 shillings.
And she is a complete mess. Her face is severely bruised. She has a nasty cut near her eye, and her arm is in a makeshift sling.
Did she get attacked again?
No. She literally just fell over a sandbag in the pitch black. She couldn't see a foot in front of her face, tripped over the civic defenses, and wiped out.
She walks into the house, looks at Clementine, and says it was a very hard lesson, and she will absolutely not be visiting that man again.
It's hilarious, but it brilliantly highlights the physical dangers of simply trying to live a normal 20-something life.
Which brings us to the closing moments of the year. Christmas, 1942.
Jeremy, ever the optimist, has these grand, romantic plans. He wants to take Clementine into central London for a lavish meal, walk around the streets to soak up whatever festive cheer is available, and attend midnight mass at St. Paul's Cathedral.
But nature, much like the war, has its own agenda.
A massive blizzard hits southern England, and the winters in the 1940s were notoriously brutal. The snow is incredibly deep, completely burying the roads and the sidewalks.
Jeremy cannot even dig his car out of the street. His grand surprise is completely ruined. They are snowed in.
But instead of despairing over another ruined plan, the household adapts. They find the joy in the limitation.
They do. The younger members of the household, Cass and Ada, go out into the freezing garden and spend hours building a huge snowman.
The adults sit in the living room by the fire. And even the fire is a struggle. It's spitting and hissing because the rationed logs are damp. But they sit there, they knit, they talk.
As evening falls, they bundle up and walk through the knee-deep snow to the local Wanstead church for a small, quiet service.
It is deeply isolating. They are cut off from the world. But it is immensely peaceful. The snow muffles the sound of the war. For one night, the sky isn't a threat. It's just weather. They have survived another year.
And that survival is the core triumph. So what does this all mean for you, the learner listening to this right now? How do we take this deep dive into the freezing, murky world of 1942 and apply it to our lives today?
The parallels to modern long-term crises are very clear.
We all deal with chronic stress. We deal with massive societal shifts, economic anxieties, pandemics, personal losses that feel like they will never end.
But this text shows us that resilience isn't always about being a superhero fighting on the front lines. You don't have to carry a rifle to be brave.
Sometimes bravery is purely administrative.
Exactly. Sometimes resilience is Mrs. Clark, a former factory worker, standing her ground against an entitled passenger on a bus.
Sometimes it's Clementine swallowing a lifetime of aristocratic pride and apologizing to her traumatized gardener.
Sometimes it's sharing a greasy portion of fish and chips on a park bench, or meticulously remaking your mother's old wedding dress, or just sitting by a damp, spitting fire with the people you love when the world outside is buried in snow. Adapting to a new normal and finding a way to laugh while doing it is a profound act of defiance.
It is. The capacity for humans to normalize the abnormal is our greatest survival trait. But I want to leave the listener with a vital piece of context.
Hold on, let me brace myself. What is it?
Remember the structure of this saga we established at the beginning. This is book 4 of a 5-part series.
Okay.
Ada, with her visions, has predicted that the war will not end until 1945. It is currently the end of 1942.
Oh my God.
Exactly. The characters have just survived this agonizing, terrifying, exhausting year. They have watched their civic infrastructure fail. They have navigated violent class collisions. They have watched their friends be imprisoned or quietly succumb to despair.
They're sitting in the snow, enjoying a fleeting moment of peace. But they're not even halfway through.
They still have 3 more years.
3 more years.
3 more years of the blackout, 3 more years of rationing, 3 more years of casualty lists, of V-1 and V-2 rockets still to come, of this exact, grinding, inescapable trauma.
That is a staggering thought to end on. Think about that. How do you wake up the next morning and the morning after that, knowing you still have a literal mountain of trauma left to climb? What does it take inside a human being to keep walking forward in the pitch dark, knowing the dawn is years away?
It brings us right back to where we started. The diagnostic X-ray is entirely broken. The future is murky and monotonous.
But you still have to take the next step.